Good evening and welcome to the first event of the Spring Speaker Series in the Future Security Initiative. For those unfamiliar, the Future Security Initiative is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, which is a DC-based think tank. For years, we were the Center on the Future of War, and then we've expanded and have a different focus or more expansive focus beginning in the summer of 2023. So we're thrilled to have you here for the first, actually, FSI Spring Speaker Series. And we're really honored to have Sarah Esther Maslin as our first speaker. She is a 2023-2024 Future Security Fellow at New America. And again, those who are familiar with our project know about this, but those who aren't, every year, New America has national fellows, and we support several of them. We're called ASU Future Security Fellows at New America. And we have like 300, 350 applicants, out of which, say, 15 to 20 are selected. So it's a very competitive process, and we're thrilled that Sarah's joined us this year. Her talk is based on a book that she's writing. It's called El Mozote, Then and Now, What the Survivors of Modern Latin America's Worst Massacre Can Teach Us About Violence, Trauma, and the Long Aftermath of America's Wars. Sarah's an independent journalist who's worked across Latin America and is currently based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. She spent nearly a decade reporting in El Salvador and focusing on El Mozote, a village where US-trained soldiers killed over 800 civilians in a massacre in 1981, which is the subject of her upcoming book. From 2018 to 2023, she was the Economist's Brazil correspondent. And before that, she was based in San Salvador. Her reportings appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The Nation, and other publications. She's a recipient of the American Society of Magazine Editors Award for journalists younger than 30, a Mirror Award for media reporting, an Ochberg Fellowship from Columbia University's Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. She's a graduate of Yale University with a degree in history, and we're thrilled to have Sarah with us. A little housekeeping. Sarah's going to make a presentation, and then I'll reappear and moderate discussions. For those who have questions, please just type them into the question box in Zoom. And once again, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, and to ASU and New America for allowing me to be here. I am straight off the plane from El Salvador, where I've just been at the election, so really looking forward to talking with all of you a little bit about that and how it fits into my book. So let's see if I can figure out this screen sharing. I just wanted to give a quick content warning. There are a few graphic pictures. And here we go. All right. Is the screen sharing working, Daniel?
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent. All right. On the day that El Salvador buried its democracy, 76-year-old Rosario Sanchez walked down a rocky road past the clearing where 24 of her family members were killed in an army massacre in 1981 and exhumed from shallow graves in 2015. She made her way to a local school where she was given a ballot with 6 faces and 6 party flags, and she cast her vote for El Salvador's populist authoritarian president, Nayib Bukele. He was running for re-election, even though the Constitution says in 6 separate places that presidents can't serve 2 consecutive terms. This is Orlando Marquez, a 65-year-old farmer whose family died in the same massacre and who accidentally unearthed his mother's skull while digging the foundation for a new house in 2010. He voted in the nearby village of El Mozote, and his ballot also went to Bukele, as did around 60% of votes in El Mozote. If you've seen any headlines about Sunday's election, you've probably heard 2 things. First, Bukele won by a landslide. Within hours after polls closed, and before even a fraction of the votes were counted, he declared himself re-elected with more than 85%. There were all sorts of problems with the election, but no one doubts that he won with an overwhelming majority. Second, the main reason usually given for his victory is how he obliterated the violent street gangs that controlled most poor neighborhoods in El Salvador by suspending constitutional rights and throwing around 2% of the population in jail. He did this by way of a state of emergency that has lasted nearly 2 years, which Salvadorans refer to simply as el régimen, or the regime. El régimen is hugely popular, even though it has meant the imprisonment, torture, and deaths without trial of innocent Salvadorans. Okay, so in around 3 minutes, I've told you about a massacre in the 1980s, gangs in the recent past, and a president who has arbitrarily imprisoned tens of thousands of people and has just been rewarded with re-election for his iron fist tactics. That's a lot of violence for a country of 6 million people. What I want to talk about today is how it's all connected. What leads a village of massacre survivors to vote for a president who treats human rights defenders as the enemy and has thwarted the legal case against the military officers accused of killing their family members? What leads a country just a generation after a civil war fought to end decades of social injustice and oppression from authoritarian governments to embrace a one-party state and a president whose running mate bragged to the New York Times about, quote, eliminating democracy and replacing it with something new? So let's leave Bukele behind for a little while for a very brief crash course on El Salvador. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, about the size of New Jersey. Its geography is dominated by mountains and volcanoes, its economy by sugarcane and coffee, and its history by extreme inequality and violence, which have always gone hand in hand. In 1932, a communist indigenous uprising of coffee pickers led to the slaughter by the army of somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people in the western part of the country, and also the near extermination of El Salvador's indigenous language and culture. The army general who led the killing spree, he had the very dictatorial name of Maximiliano Hernández Martínez, was, interestingly enough, the last Salvadoran president to finagle his way around the constitutional ban on re-election. He ruled for 13 years. In the 1970s, population growth and the economic elite's tendency to gobble up more and more of peasants' land led to another cycle of protests and repression. This time, left-wing revolutionaries inspired by socialists in Cuba and Nicaragua took to the hills, where they trained peasants in liberation theology and guerrilla warfare. The right-wing government was unable to stamp out the rebellion, even with what would end up being more than $1 million a day in military aid from the United States. The Civil War lasted for 12 years and left some 75,000 people dead and more than 1 million displaced. You can see I have notes. I was born in 1992, the year the war finally ended. But for the generation of journalists before me, El Salvador was today's Afghanistan or Iraq. It was one of the top foreign policy priorities for the Carter and Reagan administrations, who feared that if this teeny country fell to the revolutionaries, communism would spread throughout the Americas. The anti-communist fervor, which can sometimes seem caricaturesque in retrospect, but was very real at the time, caused the US government to look the other way for years when the security forces committed horrific atrocities, including scores of massacres. The worst took place in a village in the northeastern mountains called El Mozote, during a scorched earth operation to root out guerrilla fighters and destroy their civilian support. Over 3 days in December 1981, soldiers from an elite army battalion trained by American military advisors rounded up the entire population of the town, and then followed steps so uncannily similar to massacres elsewhere in the world across centuries of history that it would seem that there is a secret handbook. The soldiers forced everyone to lie face down in the plaza and separated the men, women, and children. After they had killed everyone, they set fire to the buildings and moved on to surrounding villages, where they shot, stabbed, and machete-slashed more civilians, perhaps 1,000 in all. A few survivors told their stories to journalists from the New York Times and the Washington Post, but the Salvadoran government denied that any massacre had occurred, and the American government decided to ignore the evidence and believe the Salvadoran government rather than the survivors. After the war ended, a truth commission backed by the UN dug up the remains of 143 people beneath the ruins of the church in El Mozote. All but 12 were children. It was unequivocal proof that a massacre had occurred. Still, El Salvador's Congress passed a sweeping amnesty law that halted the investigation and extinguished the possibility of justice for thousands of victims of atrocities committed during the war. Once the country was at peace, families began to move back to El Mozote, slowly at first and then more steadily. They built new homes atop the ruins of old ones. El Salvador's official post-war policy was perdonar y olvidar, forgive and forget, and so they tried to do just that. Bury their pain just as they buried their loved ones in the days after the massacre. This turned out to be impossible. I would be remiss not to mention all of the important journalism that has helped bring this massacre to light. From the first reports in early 1982 by Ray Bonner at the New York Times and Alma Guillermo Prieto at the Washington Post, the photos by Susan Meiselas, some of which you saw on the previous slides, and the damning expose of the US cover-up of the massacre by Mark Danner in The New Yorker in 1993, to more recent coverage by Salvadoran journalists at El Faro, one of the first and for a long time the only national outlets to pay attention to the forgotten town. I've been reporting in El Mozote for exactly a decade. My book follows several survivors and their families from the massacre and its immediate aftermath to the present day. By telling their stories, I tell the story of post-war El Salvador. I want readers to understand what happens over time to people in places that have been through massive upheaval, in particular from conflicts in which the United States has a hand. It has taken me a decade to put the pieces together, so summarizing what I've learned is quite a challenge, but I will try to just briefly highlight a few of the threads of the book and stories of the people I've gotten to know. So just a year before the massacre, post-traumatic stress disorder became an official diagnosis in the American DSM-3, giving legitimacy to thousands of veterans, along with victims of rape and domestic violence who had been clamoring for recognition of their ongoing suffering. In El Salvador, the leading voice on trauma, although he didn't often use that word, was the Jesuit priest and psychologist Ignacio Martín Baró. He was critical of American psychology, seeing it as too pathologizing and individualistic. The origins of trauma, he thought, lay in whatever in society was causing people suffering. He wrote, "Reacting to bombings and mass executions with uncontainable anguish has to be considered a normal reaction before abnormal circumstances, perhaps the only road left for a person to cling to life and bear such an asphyxiating knot of social relations." In other words, Salvadorans saw the world as a terrifying place for the simple fact that it was. He warned that the widespread fear and antagonism provoked by years of war could permanently damage people's ability to relate to one another and work together to build a new society. But most people weren't thinking about building a new society. They were too busy destroying the old one. Ironically, it was the murder of Martín Baró and 5 other Jesuit priests in 1989 by the same battalion that had committed the El Mozote massacre that finally brought an end to the war. The international community pressured the two sides to negotiate, and peace accords were signed. When families started moving back to El Mozote, not only were there no psychologists, but there was practically no support from the government or the international community whatsoever to rebuild their houses, recuperate their fallow fields, revive their social structures, and so on. Orlando, who you met earlier, found when he moved back in the early 2000s that the sense of mutual support and unity that had existed in the town before the massacre had been replaced by divisions, family rivalries, and fighting over scraps. It wasn't until around 2010 when a Spanish psychologist named Sol Yanez began interviewing massacre victims and organizing group therapy sessions in the lead up to an international court case that people finally began to break their silence. The sentence that resulted from that court case led to a trickle of material improvements: a health clinic, a documentary, a registry for individual financial reparations. But the government's clumsiness in implementing them also sparked new challenges and new divisions. More than a fifth of the population had to flee their homes during the war. a devastating rupture of El Salvador's social and family structures that continues to have aftershocks to this day. Many headed to the United States, where the street gangs that would later ravage the country were born among the children of immigrants in Los Angeles. Starting in the 1990s, the US deported thousands of convicted gang members. They arrived in a war-torn country with weak institutions, lots of young men with no jobs and absent parents, and weapons still lying around. The gangs spread like poison. By 2015, not only had El Salvador become the country with the highest homicide rate in the world, except for war zones like Syria, but gangs had even made their way to the remote, peaceful mountains. A group of gangsters fleeing the police in the cities took refuge in the outskirts of El Mozote and started moving drugs, extorting massacre victims, and murdering enemies, including one young woman whose main crime was breaking up with her gang member boyfriend. This was horrifying to Orlando, who had moved his family back precisely to escape gangs in the capital, San Salvador. Meanwhile, his eldest son was living on Long Island, where, thanks to a broken US immigration system that left thousands of child migrants with little support, El Salvador's gangs were creeping into Latino neighborhoods and spilling blood there too. As I mentioned earlier, there was a brief moment of truth-telling after the 1992 peace accords, in which a commission from the United Nations investigated human rights abuses committed during the war, and exhumations were carried out in El Mozote. That moment came to a sudden halt with a blanket amnesty law in 1993, which had been secretly agreed upon by both sides before the peace accords were even signed. The amnesty guaranteed impunity to those accused of even the worst war crimes, some of whom went on to become mayors, congresspeople, and presidents. But it had an even more damaging effect. All investigations were immediately shuttered, and victims in El Mozote and other massacre sites were denied the chance to learn the truth about their loved ones' deaths and to give their remains a proper burial. The warring sides morphed into the dominant political parties after the war, right-wing Orena and the left-wing FMLN. They justified the amnesty law to Salvadorans, the UN, and the US by promising sweeping justice reform, which would ensure that impunity would only apply to the past. But that justice reform, for the most part, never happened, and instead, weakened judicial institutions with a legacy of sweeping skeletons under the rug were left to face new threats, gangs that were quickly taking control of wide swaths of the country, and massive corruption that would ultimately taint both political parties. The amnesty law, which was supposed to ensure peace and reconciliation, looked in retrospect like El Salvador's original sin. So here we are, in this time period from around 2016 to 2019, which I refer to as the reckoning. On the one hand, the government is finally starting to pay attention to El Mozote, and it looks like massacre victims may finally have a chance at justice in a groundbreaking case. On the other hand, the country is clobbered by all these problems. The gangs are in an all-out war with the police, while the two sides from the Civil War basically took their ideological battles to the political arena. And after years of gridlock, the two warring parties haven't done nearly enough when it comes to the everyday problems Salvadorans face: poverty, healthcare, education, and above all, security. Meanwhile, corruption scandals have landed two former presidents in jail, and another has fled to Nicaragua. Enter Nayib Bukele. I don't have too much time, so the Bukele crash course is going to be quick. Someone else can write the Nayib Bukele book. But in 2019, he is mayor of San Salvador and orchestrates a falling out with the left-wing FMLN, the party that Salvadorans have grown disillusioned with after the left finally came to power in 2009. People hoped that would bring lots of progressive social change. Instead, it brought more corruption scandals and continued violence. This break with the party allows Bukele to position himself as an outsider. His pre-politics career was in public relations, and he is brilliant at social media. It also helps that he's still in his 30s. Bukele manages to convince enough Salvadorans that he's the country's savior, to win comfortably in 2019. In 2021, his party gets a supermajority in legislative elections, which allows him to replace the Attorney General, Supreme Court judges, and eventually a third of the entire justice system, including the judge who had been close to issuing a verdict on the case against the massacre perpetrators. That case gets stalled once again. At this point, Nayib controls all three branches of government, and it's easy for him to ask Congress to renew 21 times the state of exception and to ask the Supreme Court to bend the Constitution to allow him to run for re-election. There's a powerful moment in his speech on election night where he calls out journalists and human rights organizations, this was just a few days ago, and basically says, what you call democracy, human rights, is putting the human rights of gang members above those of other Salvadorans. Why do you want them to kill us, he says? Why do you want to see Salvadoran blood? Why should we and our children die for you to be satisfied that we're respecting your false democracy, that you don't even respect in your own countries? So I just wanted to share quickly this slide here from some polling that was done before the election, showing where people put the Constitution versus their religion and Nayib Bukele. When I asked people in El Mozote why they were voting for Bukele, a lot of them mentioned the gang crackdown. Gang violence never got bad in El Mozote, but it was a fear when they traveled to nearby cities. Some people talked about the money he has invested in the town center, a fountain that lights up at night, a soon-to-be inaugurated community center, computers for kids in the school. But most people expressed mainly a sense of resignation, of frustration, of disillusionment with the traditional political parties, with the left, with the guerrilla that controlled the region of the country and for which many of them risked their lives to fight. This is the feeling Nayib Bukele originally tapped into before the gang state of exception, the failure of El Salvador's politicians to deal with the consequences of the war and the problems that sparked the war in the first place, and the failure as well of the international community. Though Bukele didn't say it in these words in his speech, a lot of people in El Mozote reminded me that the US government is selective about when it decides to be concerned about human rights. Where were they after the massacre, people asked. So I wanted to leave you with these two images. Nayib Bukele has realized what a lot of historians write whole books about, the symbolism of monuments and of destroying them. The image on the left is from his very first day of office, when he ordered via Twitter that the name of the colonel in charge of the battalion that committed the El Mozote massacre be removed from army barracks. That gave massacre survivors immense hope. Just a few months later, however, he refused to open military archives to the judge overseeing the case. And since then came the judicial reform that got rid of that judge. In the end, it was just for show. The name of Domingo Monterrosa remains on soldiers' uniforms. The image on the right shows the recent destruction, also ordered by Bukele's government, of a monument to reconciliation in San Salvador, which celebrated the signing of the peace accords in 1992. I asked a young construction worker who was working on the final part of taking it down just a few days ago what the monument was all about. He told me he was born in 2002. He said the monument celebrated secret deals between the previous left-wing government and the gangs. He didn't know about the peace accords, and he hadn't heard about the El Mozote massacre. I think that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great presentation. It's a very powerful image, what you just showed at the end, and I think maybe that's a place to start, partly because for those of us who work in universities and teach people of different ages, one of the most striking things about this moment in the US, and maybe it's also true in El Salvador, is how few people are aware of the conflicts in Central America, how prominent they were in US politics and how significant the tumult there was for the projection of US power and even for things that are now on the front page of the newspapers, say, migration to the US and other issues. So I'm just wondering, um, is it also true in El Salvador that when you talk to younger people, that there is not much knowledge, focus, engagement, awareness of the devastating civil war that killed 70,000 or so people?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, certainly this young construction worker who was, in his early 20s, he didn't really have much of an awareness of the Civil War. I think, I think the one thing to sort of, I guess there's two ways that explain that lack of awareness. I mean, one of them is that there really isn't a huge emphasis on teaching history. I'm going to mess up the year, but history became, a major only a couple of decades ago at the National University. It didn't even exist as, a career until relatively recently. And when you look, I had a phase of this long project where I went and tried to see what they said in the school textbooks about the war, and the war is a page or two with a real emphasis on kind of the parties coming together, signing peace accords, reconciliation, and moving on. And the massacre was nowhere in there. And I'm told that even now in El Mozote, and this is really interesting, even in El Mozote, they don't teach the massacre in the schools. So a lot of kids kind of, um, grew up hearing these women who make money by, getting a few coins from tourists, tell the story in a way that is often very sensational. Occasionally they bring in personal details, but that's mixed in with things that they've learned from books or from Mark Danner's report, which was then translated into Spanish. So you've got a lot of kind of stuff coming in there, but there's no official version. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention is just, I mean, I think especially for young people, they've lived through a different war. I mean, the violence of the gangs was such a, a defining experience, and um, I think the Civil War feels almost far away at this point when you've lived through, 5, 10, 20 years of gang violence and all of the kind of ups and downs and the restrictions that has created and the trauma that comes along with that as well. And so I think, especially for younger people, like the Civil War feels ages ago instead of just a generation ago.
To everybody in the audience, please feel free to drop questions into the question box in Zoom, and we'll present them. Um, so the talk is what the massacre in El Mozote, this terrible event that was complexly covered. It was both covered and repressed. Its coverage was repressed, but it does remain, at least for those who follow human rights and politics in the region, as a major event. But what can it teach us? And when I say us, which us? Can it teach us something in the U.S. now? Um, and let's talk about that. And then maybe, can it still teach Salvadorans something, given that, your point's well taken, people are busy facing all sorts of other crises. So, what can this teach us here in the U.S. and what can it teach, Salvadorans, given how long ago it occurred?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, in terms of the U.S., I think, I mean, the the thing that's always interested me so much about this massacre is how it continues to ripple through the lives of everyone who live in this town. I mean, perhaps this young construction worker in San Salvador hadn't heard of the massacre, and perhaps young people even growing up in El Mozote don't know all of the details, but it affects their everyday lives in so many ways. I mean, I think I didn't get to talk about it, but I put a little quote from Orlando, um, sort of lamenting the way that there was a real sense of kind of unity and cooperation in this town in the decades leading up to the massacre, at a time when El Salvador was really, struggling with poverty and land shortages. This was a town of people who had come together and were working on kind of an agricultural cooperative where they shared machinery and getting grants, and they've really struggled since then. And I think what people talk about, both professional psychologists but also just people from the town, is how hard it is to trust one another, and how people even 30 years later are have this sort of mentality of it's better to just stay in my family with the people I trust and do things on my own. And that really did come from the massacre and from the war. And I think that's something that you see in a lot of places that have been through something like this. So I think, the lesson, there's all this talk after a conflict, especially one that the US is involved in, about democracy building and support to rebuild both like places like Mozote, but also institutions like justice systems, and build all of those things up. But I think like it's a lot harder to put something back together once you've broken it. And to a certain extent, after this war, at least, the attention moved elsewhere. The Berlin Wall fell, and the U.S. Was no longer as concerned about the threat of communism in Latin America, and our attention shifted to other parts of the world, while El Salvador was sort of left to deal with the consequences. Um, and as for your second question about sort of what Salvadorans can learn, I think um, it is kind of heartening when you see, over time. I think there is more of an awareness of this massacre, thanks to things like this international court case, and even really simple things like they've paved the road, which makes it easier now for people to go into town. So people are saying that there's more tourists arriving. There's been sort of there's little businesses that are popping up, but you have to sort of contrast that with the passing of time and of history, and of sort of younger generations who aren't necessarily taught this story. And so I think um, how El Salvador kind of creates its own historical memory about the war is something that's always been very politicized. There's been the sort of the left that has their version of the social fight for justice, and taking the fight to the mountains, and all of that. But then once the left got kind of corrupted and tainted, suddenly this sort of effort to create a history was without a home. It no longer had a home on the political left. And so now kind of these people in Mozote and organizations that were allied with the FMLN are now having to sort of find their own way. And I think that's going to take a little while.
A question here from Ganesh Murat Tazgor, who's the school director of the School of Policy and Global Studies, where our FSI is based. How organized are the people, including survivors of El Mozote, in terms of seeking justice and demanding accountability? The paradigmatic case in Latin America being the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo.
Sure. So, sort of this period that I talked about, starting around 2010 or so, and kind of up into the present, has really seen huge changes in El Mozote. So, after the massacre, everyone was displaced. They went, to the outskirts of cities and to refugee camps, and it really took quite a while. But after the war, when some groups of refugees came back and started a different community kind of near El Mozote, some of these gears started turning, and there was a little tiny group that went and filed the very first criminal complaint before the war was even over, which ended up sort of contributing to this period of the UN and exhumations. And so there was this little nucleus, but there were very few people. They were very brave, and the vast majority of survivors were too afraid. And that actually led to kind of this narrative that there was only one survivor, or only a couple survivors, because the massacre took place both in El Mozote, the main village, but also in a bunch of other ones. And for a very long time, people in those other villages were too afraid. But starting with this international court case, and thanks to both people's own courage, but also really to the help of some key human rights organizations, including one called Tutela Legal, which worked for a very long time with the Catholic Church and then ended up breaking off in 2013. They, were able to get this international court case, the ball rolling on this international court case, which takes a while. If you know the kind of inter-American court system, it can take many years for a complaint to be accepted and evidence to be gathered. But eventually, by sort of the mid 2000s, they had accepted the case, which then allowed for a psychologist to be contracted to go and start kind of talking to people and interviewing people. And it was really this kind of amazing period of time where this team of a nun and a priest and a psychologist, and we're kind of going house to house and starting to talk to people and sort of gauge their willingness to testify. And Rosario actually was one of the people who ended up testifying in sort of a really kind of both in Ecuador in this international court case, but then also in the Salvadoran hearings that were opened up, and so over time there has been more activism, I think, but then also, like, for the past couple of years, Bukele's government has put a bit of a damper on that, because there was a judge in El Salvador who after, I'm realizing I think I might have actually missed a page of my talk, because I talk about the amnesty law getting struck down?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay. Well, that's good. After the amnesty law was struck down, there was a judge at this courtroom in El Salvador who was trying, to be independent and consider the evidence, and hearings were held in which I think actually dozens of survivors were going and kind of giving their testimony. But then he was removed in Bukele's judicial reform, and since then you've kind of seen the door to justice closing once again.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about the Inter-American Court and maybe the Inter-American Human Rights System, because particularly something about its fairly expansive way of resolving cases. It's quite different than a lot of the way people typically understand courts, with its reparation system and on, and maybe that would be illustrative for for responding to Ganesh's question and just more generally.
Sure. Yeah. So the Inter-American Court system, and you probably know a lot more about it than I do, but it's connected to the Organization of American States, and the way that it works is often these are cases where countries have failed to have failed to deliver justice, and in this case, the state itself was both responsible for the massacre and then for decades of negligence to deliver legal justice. And so this there's a process by which the parties, in this case the massacre victims, who were represented by several different kind of human rights and legal organizations, say to the Inter-American Court, which is presided often by very prominent legal scholars from different countries in Latin America. They say that that the state has failed them in these ways, and a very exhaustive investigation and process is then done, and it gives them the chance, I think, and this is kind of what my book is told really from the survivor's perspective. It gives them a chance to be able to tell their stories before before this international panel, and that is then published in this case, I think it was 200-page long sentence that describes in great detail the massacre itself and everything, all of their attempts at justice in El Salvador and how it was denied, and calls out the different institutions, and then it when the sentences are successful, recommendations are given to the guilty party, to the guilty Salvadoran state in this case. And that sentence was really a game changer, actually. I mean, I think that's when you started seeing some of the trickle of reparations. some of them for the town as a whole, some of them for individuals. And in this case, the government did accept the sentence. And so that kind of took very many years and it went very, very slowly. But it did make a really big difference in the end for people, both, I think, psychologically and economically in a lot of cases.
A question here from Scott Wallace. Do you believe that those who struggle to preserve the historical memory of the Civil War will succeed in keeping those memories alive? Is there a new polarization opening up in El Salvador between them and Bukele's followers?
Yeah. Um, yeah, this is really tricky. I mean, I think I mean, what you've seen, what I've been sort of observing from afar for the most part for the past couple years. I managed to get back once every year or two, but one of the things that was really striking and kind of tragic was the way that the survivors in El Mozote and their lawyers from Tutela Legal were cast as enemies by Bukele. He went and gave a speech in Mozote a couple years ago where he said the peace accords were a farce and these human rights lawyers are just trying to make money off of the victims. And and I'm the real you're as your president, I'm the one who's really making a difference in your lives because of this beautiful fountain that I've built for you and these computers I'm giving your children and so on. And so I think I think that made some victims more hesitant to get involved with this whole kind of justice clamor, and they began to think, well, am I going to be better off if I kind of keep my mouth shut and accept these things that the government's giving me because that's what's being offered right now in this whole quest to justice. Who knows if it'll even work out? And so I think that I think it there is kind of a sense uh, of division now, and it's made the work a lot harder for people who are trying to, despite extreme kind of difficulties now and risks as well. There are legal risks now in supporting this fight for justice and in opposing Bukele's government. And I think that's only going to get worse going forward.
Question here from Bjorn Kondorfer, who runs the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University. Should we look at El Salvador as a failed state or something closer to a dictatorship? The resonant violence from such massacres as El Mozote, are they the secret heartbeat of the violence and the breakdown? What is the outlook?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's been a whole debate among journalists. It's interesting about whether the word dictate, when can we use the word dictatorship? I mean, I have certain journalist friends in El Salvador who've been using it now for a couple of years about Bukele. Um, I think, I think at this point I'm comfortable saying dictatorship. I think though I mean, one thing that I'm trying to do in this book, and time will tell if I'm successful, is to connect the violence of the past, and in particular the impunity that kind of came out of that violence, with the violence of the present, which I had always thought in the book would be, would kind of end with the gangs, but is really now morphed into this new phase of violence from the state
Mhm.
once again, in the form of these arbitrary imprisonments. And let's hope it doesn't get worse, but I think it probably will at some point. um, but I mean, I guess I remember the question makes me think of something that a judge who was working on the case for an earlier part of the trial said to me once, and he said something like, what a again, what a gang members, what lesson did they learn? They saw the way that that people were just slaughtered during the war, and then the people who committed those crimes were just given a free pass. What message did that send? What message does that send about this country and about the institutions in this place? And so I think, I mean, beating heart, original sin, however you want to put it. I think that I think that a lot of what uh, of what we're seeing is cyclical. Going back to the massacre in 1932, going back to, I mean, you could go all the way back to colonization if you wanted to, but I don't have the space for that. But yes, I do think that like these are cycles, and that that it's gotten to a point that it's going to be, that it is going to be very hard to get out of.
A question from Sean Doherty. How do those who live in El Mozote today feel about the recent dismantling of the Monument to Truth and Reconciliation and the current government's efforts to erase their history? Are the survivors a minority in terms of wanting their stories to be told?
Mm-hmm. Um, So I think, I mean, the just the logistical thing, which is that the monument to reconciliation is in San Salvador, and I mean, it's a little bit complicated because that monument people never really loved for aesthetic reasons. They just thought it was kind of ugly. Um, so it was never a hugely popular monument, but the destruction of it has obviously huge kind of symbolic resonance. I think people in Almosote, I mean, the question that I pose to people less than, instead of asking them about that monument in particular because it's sort of far away physically, was, are they worried about democracy? Are they worried about Bukele having so much power? And um, some people said that the kind of the censorship, the sense that if you say something, you might miss out on an opportunity to get a job in the government. If people find out that you supported the justice fight, you could not receive a certain benefit. Like all of that is starting to make people think of the war, especially people who lived through the war, saying, seeing innocent people carted off by the police. It's starting to kind of cause a sort of deja vu for people. And yet, when I ask about kind of worries about democracy, most most people answer, yes, it's worrisome, but, and the yes, but always goes to the much more present problems that they feel right now, which are, food, um, the gangs. People, even in Almosote, are very afraid, or they have family members living elsewhere, or they've been very influenced by the social media. Bukele said that the other parties, the minute that they became president, they would release all the gang members. And one young woman who's just a little bit younger than me, and knows the history of the massacre back to back, and has really spent a lot of her time volunteering in the judicial case. When I asked her if she was worried, she said, I'm worried I have to take my kid to school in the morning. I'm worried because it's, midnight and all the votes haven't been counted. There were all these problems with the election, questions about the electronic system, and was it rigged, and was it fair? And I think, I mean, she was sort of concerned about those things, but also she was tired and very resigned to the fact that this guy has all the power, and there's nothing that can be done about it. And I think that's almost even scarier.
So during the various Central American peace processes, Salvador, Guatemala, and even Nicaragua in its particular case, but one of the dominant themes that motivated the those who were celebrating this transition to democracy from authoritarian rule was the importance of human rights as a kind of foundation and a cornerstone for a brighter future. How these days in Salvador, and maybe with a reflection on the Amazonia massacre, has the human rights discourse become sullied? Is it just not a term or a set of ideas that resonates with those
Yeah.
trying to make things better?
Um, I think, of course you're always going to have journalists and academics and human rights advocates who who believe in the human rights discourse because they believe in the people that they're trying to fight for. But I guess when you talk to everyday people in El Salvador, the reason that the human rights discourse, quote unquote, is sullied I think has sort of um, two factors. One of them is that for so long, as I said earlier, it was kind of associated with this left wing party that that ended up being corrupt and that ended up being just as kind of using the same iron fist tactics as as the right wing, and in the end, it kind of this holier than thou idea that that the left was more progressive, just and more cleaner, just sort of fell apart. And then the other thing that Bukele realized and has really kind of uh, capitalized on is this this thought that that why should we respect human rights when gang members have so thoroughly not respected them? And I don't know if I made this clear from my from my talk, but the gangs just wreaked incredible havoc. They spilled so much blood. The state of emergency was kicked off in 2021 because there was now I'm really getting into the nitty gritty, but there's a lot of evidence that Nayib Bukele's government, until that moment, was negotiating with the gangs. All the politicians did it. It was sort of, they trade money for votes, they trade, homicide rate. Why don't you keep murders down for a while and we will reward you with your influence in who's going to be the next, such and such security minister. All of that was happening kind of under the radar at the same time that the governments were, putting the police on the streets and the soldiers on the streets and trying to make it look like they were, completely against the gangs. And so Nayib's government, too, for a while was having these conversations with gang members, letting them out of prison, giving them certain benefits. And then, that all broke down in this one weekend where some gang members were arrested. They got angry and they just killed, I think, something like 70 something people in the course of 3 days. It was sort of the bloodiest 3 days ever since, the early years after the war. And these were all innocent people. They were not, none of them had, and I probably the word innocent isn't right, but they weren't people that had ties to gangs. They were just killing people to, to show a statement to the government. And that was something that, that has been done at various moments over the past, 20, 30 years as a kind of a power tactic by the gangs. So Salvadorans, getting back to the question, when human rights organizations come out and say, we're worried about the human rights of these prisoners. We're worried that these people haven't had a trial. We're worried that there are people who are dying of pneumonia in prison because the prisons are overcrowded. A lot of people, they just don't have the energy to, to think about that because they have been so oppressed for so many years by these gang members who control their neighborhoods, who extort them, who have killed their friends and their family members. And so I think, the whole human rights discourse kind of broke apart with the gangs in El Salvador's recent history.
Um, to the degree that, sorry, Erna Rosado, a question. Yes, we will send the link out. So quick question for those wanting to see the video, we post the video on our YouTube channel. So it's very easy to find those once we get them posted. Give us a couple weeks. Hugo Santos' question, is there anything that could threaten Bukele to maintain his control and power in the near future?
Yeah. So that polling that I cited earlier, it's interesting when you ask people what their principal concern is or their main worry. This is a set of polls actually that the UCA, the Central American University, has been doing for many, many years. And so you can sort of see how it's changed over time. And for most of El Salvador's kind of recent past, going back a decade or more, security and violence was always the number one concern. And then there was a very brief blip during the pandemic when it became pandemic and health, and then security again. And then things began to change with Bukele and with the regime, and the streets got, the gangs started to disappear and security went down. And the one that kind of crept up that had always been there all along, but never quite at the top, was the economy and poverty. And that has become, people, our poverty's been going up, inflation, prices have been going up, and salaries haven't been sort of keeping track. And um, I think despite having worked for The Economist, I am not an expert on El Salvador's economy. But I think that there is a question of how long he can sustain some of these sort of populist methods that he's been using of giving people food packages and doing all of these really glitzy reforms. A lot of it he's needed to go into pretty serious debt to do, and there may come a point when that gets harder to sustain, and when the gang locking up gang members and the security issue, which has come as a huge relief and a boost in popularity, is no longer a novelty anymore, and people start to question other aspects of his presidency.
Are you finding in your recent visits to El Salvador that many people are planning to travel to the U.S. as a way out of all of this difficult situation?
Yeah. Um, well, I think that migration to El Salvador is always going to be um, is always going to be there. It's always kind of a feasible way to try to get out of of poverty, and a lot of Salvadorans also have family members in the U.S. And so I think this kind of idea of the American dream, even though often the journey is really grueling, and conditions once you get to the U.S. are really grueling, as I'm sure everybody knows. Um, but I think there has been a slight dip in the numbers of Salvadoran migrants, at least in the last couple of years, which is interesting because almost all other countries have really gone up. You read the news in the US,
Mm.
you see that. And so, this is all again tied into like policy, and when the US is critical and when it isn't. But for a while, a couple of years ago, the US was very critical of Bukele and of some of these anti democratic turns. It's been a lot more accommodating over the past year or so, and there's, a lot of speculation and some reporting that suggests U.S. officials saying, sort of off the record, that part of why the U.S. has stopped, condemning Bukele's authoritarian tactics is because they're happy with the way that, that migration has come down. And so, I think migration will continue, but at least right now, it's actually down a little bit. And what you saw, this is the other interesting thing. What you saw actually at the election were massive numbers of Salvadorans who live in the U.S. traveling back to El Salvador to vote for Bukele. The number of Salvadorans based in the U.S. who voted in this election was like 50, 60 times greater than in any previous election. And that was kind of amazing to me to walk through the kind of center of San Salvador, which Naib has cleaned up and put lights in, and this new big library that China built, and you met all these Salvadorans who actually live in New Jersey or New York or Texas, but they'd gone back because for the first time ever, they feel hopeful and they wanted to vote for this guy. So it was kind of this crazy, you know, weird shock between knowing what he means for the country and its democracy, but then talking to people who are really excited about him and willing to take that compromise.
We just have time for one last pretty quick question, and I'm wondering, because your talk title speaks about the long aftermath of America's wars, and one of the classic understandings of Central America was that the governments there were sort of in the pocket of the U.S. That is to say, the U.S. exercised extraordinary influence over what occurred. Certainly, that was the case during the Civil War, when the U.S. poured money in and kept the military afloat. Um, uh, so, what does it feel like now? Is it still true that the US has this domineering presence and is able to affect domestic policy? Or have things shifted as one of the long aftermaths of America's wars, that the US has actually lost its ability to affect issues?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, well, I think it's, compared to what it has been historically, the U.S. has definitely lost influence. To the point when I was going to people's houses to do interviews, you see these, these bags of grains and of food that are in these 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 sacks, the pouches, and the pouches, the names on there are, it's from China. So you see Chinese letters that China has donated all of this food to El Salvador's government, which it then, donates to people. The library has big Chinese letters on it. It's a donation from China, and so you see, I think, and this is a political move as well on the part of Bukele, that he wants to say, hey, you're not the only one that that's influencing me, and
Mhm.
we don't need you to the U.S. But I don't know. I think it's one thing what is the message that you're kind of projecting out, and it's another thing what's happening behind closed doors. I would suspect that partly because there's so many Salvadorans also living in the United States, that there's going to need to be a relationship, and there will be pressure going back and forth, and we've seen, I guess, in other countries in Central America, certain moments where U.S. ambassadors or the embassy have sort of put their foot down, and it has seemed to make a difference. So I guess I would say, yes, less, but still there.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been a fascinating presentation, and it really brings together a lot of intersecting ideas about what war means, about what trauma is, how history gets processed. So thank you so much for being an ASU Future Security Fellow with us this year. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you again at our future events. And to everybody, good night.